welcome. We're going to start now. My name's Diane Minnis, and on behalf of the Pride History Group and First Mardi Gras Incorporated, I'd like to welcome you to today's forum, the Lavender Menace, the early Australian lesbian movement. And I'd first like to acknowledge that we meet today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I honour their elders, past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Now I'd like to say to our speakers today, sorry I'm in the way, Robert's taking photos, is that okay? Anyone not want to be in photos? Alright? And William is videoing it so we can put it up on our website.
Look this way. That's it. Smile. Great, thank you.
Is that okay with everyone except our friend in the corner?
Yes.
Thank you.
Joe, so will that be put up in its entirety or be edited?
In its entirety.
Good.
Yeah. So I'd like to, of course, welcome our speakers, Sue Wills, Sophie Robinson and Robin Plaister, who are going to talk today. And they've variously been participants in, written about or researched all sorts of things to do with the early Australian lesbian movement. And first up, they're going to cover different aspects of that.
I think that's
Can you stop interrupting her?
I don't respond to male
Oh dear.
it's a smile.
So first up, I'd like to introduce. That's worse. First up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sue Wills, who's had a long career in. Dr. Sophie Robinson, who's had a very short career in academia, and has recently, in the last few years, completed her PhD in the early lesbian movements of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. She's going to touch on the Australasian lesbian movement, which was formed 50 years ago, and this is basically the anniversary that we're celebrating here today. The first lesbian organisation that was formed. And Sophie is also Secretary of the Pride History Group.
Thanks, Diane. Can everyone hear that okay?
Yeah.
No? Yes, great. It's great to see so many people here. As Diane mentioned, I am an academic, I'm a historian, and I teach women's and gender studies at the University of New South Wales. My research has largely focused on the emergence and development of lesbian activism in Australia since the beginnings of Women's Lib, Gay Lib and CAMP. In 2018, I finished my thesis, PhD thesis, which was a history of lesbian feminism in Australia during the 70s, 80s and 90s. And I conducted around 30 to 40 oral histories with lesbian activists, many of whom were politicised in the 1970s, but also some who remembered the time before that, what it was like to live in Sydney and other parts of Australia, in which their lesbian identities were shrouded in a lot of secrecy, or there was a lot more meeting together and finding networks privately without much support and visibility in wider society. So one thing that was really obvious for me when I started my PhD research was the real lack of attention given to Australian lesbian history overall, and also that a lot of the research and discussions about lesbianism and feminism in Australia was often directed to overseas examples, so in the US and UK. But I knew from doing some research that there were lots of really, really interesting and vibrant examples of lesbian activism here, and I wanted to look into that. So historians and other scholars started to themselves look into this in the 1980s and 1990s. People like Ruth Ford, Lucy Chesser, and of course Sue Wills, and her very important thesis, started to do this. And since the early 2000s, this is growing and growing, and more people like Rebecca Jennings, who had a book launch here a couple of years ago for her book on Sydney lesbian history, and my own research has started to look at the variety and depth of of Australian lesbian communities that have existed. So what initially sparked my interest was reading studies of the pre-1970s lesbian scene, lesbian organisations and communities before the arrival of Women's Lib and Gay Lib and CAMP. And this included finding out about somewhat private and secretive lesbian meetups at some bars in the city and or in other people's homes and at private parties, as well as more organised communities such as the Australasian lesbian movement. Again, people like Sue Wills and Lucy Chesser both have talked about how this movement, the Australasian lesbian movement, was the first openly homosexual organisation, preceding CAMP, though a lot of people often debate whether or not it was avowedly political and whether it was actually doing something different. The Australasian lesbian movement began in 1969 in Melbourne. It was a group of 5 women, initially intended to be a chapter of the Daughters of Bilitis, which was an American lesbian organisation. 2 of the Australasian lesbian movement's founding members wrote to the Daughters of Bilitis requesting some assistance in setting up a group in Melbourne. They were Marion Paul and Claudia Pearce. By 1970, ALM had 15 members. It's important to note that at this time, lesbian networks were really difficult to locate, though many did exist. And so ALM offered quite a visible centre point for lesbian social life, or at least something for lesbians to access. And members were very much trying to counteract that lesbian invisibility in society. They made a statement early on that their primary aim was in educating the general public about and challenging various taboos and stereotypes of lesbian identity, and encouraging this idea that lesbians were just like everybody else, normal members of society that needed access to resources and support and, of course, rights. This was a context in which campaign against moral persecution, gay liberation and women's liberation had yet to emerge and gain momentum, and so ALM was a very big shift, a very important shift. Though some lesbians have talked about finding it at the time too radical, something they wanted to stay clear of, and others deemed it not radical enough at the time. It was a really courageous movement in its engagement with the media and its efforts to be visible. It had quite a strategic placement of Beatrice Faust as its public spokesperson, who was co-founder of the Women's Electoral Lobby, amongst other things. They approached university staff, social workers, psychiatrists, and businesses for support. They had a member put their phone number in their public advertisements for people to ring and speak to them, just for support, basically. Sue Wills, again, and others have noted how these strategies of the ALM, we can see them as early forms of consciousness raising, that this movement was challenging very specific and entrenched taboos about lesbianism and encouraging lesbians, at least trying to encourage lesbians to feel more safe in themselves and their identities and encourage a public presence and discussion about lesbianism. The movement lasted only a few years. I think it wrapped up in about 1973, though there were still sort of pockets of meetings, and it had fully intended to go beyond its Melbourne base, but didn't quite make it. And by then, by 1973, we have women's liberation, gay liberation and CAMP well and truly on the scene, and as I think Sue and Robin will highlight, that these movements offered something quite more expansive for lesbian identity and politics and activism than ALM had offered, but obviously its importance in this history is undeniable, and I might leave it there.
We're going to take questions at the end if that's all right with everyone, so everyone can have a bit of a go. We're going to get Sue Wills to speak, and Sue was the first, with Lex Watson, the first co-president of CAMP from 72 to 74, and as Sophie's indicated, has written and researched extensively in terms of women's liberation, gay liberation and various other sorts of things there.
Can I indulge your...
I'm having trouble speaking at the moment. My brain is not working properly, so I'm going to try and persevere by speaking very slowly, okay? Sorry. Okay. Chris Pole was the first member with John Ware of the founding of camp, and I was in a sense a second wave. When Chris and John founded camp, they set up a women's group, and the speaker who was most important in that women's group was dear Margaret Jones, who persevered against relentless male sexism to keep within camp a group of women. In the end, she gave up and went to her home in Balmain, and she tried to start a branch of the ALM in Sydney. I wasn't sure exactly what Margaret was trying to do, but I was encouraged by John Ware to go along to that meeting and convince the women who Margaret no, that was the word, but that'll do. Margaret, of course, intended to keep to herself, and I dragged the women back to camp, and it took her a very long time for her to forgive me for stealing her women. But she did eventually. The camp constitution followed, and there were two co-presidents, Lex Watson and myself, and that was deliberate. And we set up a women's group within camp, called the CWA, the Camp Women's Association. Deliberately, which the journalist Margaret Jones noted was named with malice aforethought. It was helpful for people to say, I'm going to a CWA meeting. Remember, it's 1972. There were very, very few people who were out. We introduced women's liberation ideas into camp women's group. There were some heady meetings about lesbian and not needing liberation from women's liberationists, but it's stuck in both places. There were similar problems with the camp women's organisation that Margaret Jones had with her group of women. We were unable to allow to keep any money that we raised. It was meant to go to the coffers of camp, but we wanted it for our own purposes, as a matter of principle as well, actually. And the camp men didn't seem to just get it. I can remember one occasion when my partner Gabby Antolovich went feral because Brian Woodward had organised an exhibition of makeup to attend the camp women's meeting. So he did not understand. As co-presidents, Lex and I spoke all over the place. We were cheap after dinner speakers for Rotary clubs, and we did it because it actually seemed to make a difference. And one of the things we learned to deal with was hecklers. I had wonderful experience of a I think it was a Jewish rabbi who told me that I could not possibly be a lesbian because that would mean the end of civilization. That left me feeling really powerful. There was another occasion when there was a fellow who didn't believe again, well, I just hadn't met the right man yet. So I just said, well, maybe you haven't either. But you learn those kinds of tactics and you have to do it, otherwise you'd go nuts. But the other thing was we had to have fun. It's a serious business. We were trying to change the world, but unless you had fun at the same time, you'd go spare. You just couldn't do it. One of the things that I became involved in with camping was the Neil McConaughey, who was the leading aversion therapist, mainly for men, in Sydney. And again, he, along with others, underestimated women. And he actually said it. The thing, his biggest mistake was that he underestimated me. I didn't say anything wrong to him. I taped an interview, gave him back the interview, transcribed it, and he was happy with it, but it caused him a great deal of angst. And he died as a gay man, which you do know. We put up a lot of things that had to do with, the people that you see on the front of the leaflet, Mim Loftus and Sue Hollis. I can remember we were putting up posters one night, and I was driving the car, and the back seat was missing. And Mim and Sue were in the back with a bucket of glue and posters, and we were putting them up around the city, and I think it was the posters that said something, Bill posters will be prosecuted, and Mary posters will be persecuted. But the interesting thing about that was that the police just pulled us over, and the policeman went around to the front of while I was driving and said, "Do you know that people are doing illegal things out of the back of your car?" Really? They were very tolerant. Anyway, we drove around the block, and because the glue was still wet after he left, put them back up again. I mean, this is the fun you had to do with getting with. People probably don't notice because these days it's concentrated on Peter Bonsalboon and Peter Duval, but there were two lesbians in the checkerboard program, Gabby Ontolovich and myself. And that was more difficult for both her parents and my parents. I mean, my parents, I told them because they might see me on television, and they didn't quite know how much they'd seen me on television. But Gabby's parents were even harder. It was very, very hard to come out, and people came out in strange ways. There was a wonderful story about a woman who had practiced and practiced and practiced about how she would tell her parents that she was a lesbian, and she would say, okay, Mum, I'm a lesbian and I'm going down the road to buy a dozen eggs. It came out as, hi Mum, I'm an egg and I'm going out to buy a dozen egg lesbians. But it's just those things just kept going. Gabby and I left camp because it was another wave of women who left camp after Margaret Jones. I think that's probably what forgave her, allowed her to forgive me. And that was the point at which Robin took over with Marg McMahon in 74. So I'll leave that there. Okay. Well, it wasn't too bad.
Thanks, Sue. And next we have the next wave of activism in camp was Robin Plaister, the executive from 73 to 78, bringing lesbian issues into the women's liberation movement and gay liberation, and also very famous for wearing her I Am a Lesbian Tart t-shirt to every demonstration for the next 20 years. I did ask her to wear it today, and she still fits into it, but she didn't.
Don't worry, it's going in the archives. I'm the lucky last on the speaking thing, so some of what I was going to say has been covered. However, look, I'd love to dedicate what we're doing today to my good friend Margaret Jones, who died in February last year, actually, just shy of 92, who called herself the Warrior Woman, and in essence was, you know, a couple of decades older than me, and I think, you know, out of style of the women in that sort of era was political and maintained the politicalness right to the end. So as the others have given some general history, look, my experiences started in camp because that's all I was aware of at that time, and it came about because of seeing Sue and Gabby on the Checkerboard ABC program in 1972. And so I joined camp at the end of 1972, start of 73, and I joined the Camp Women's Association, as it was, the CWA, which really was a women's group dedicated to getting the women together, usually on a Wednesday night in camp. But before I go into that, I just wanted to give you a background of what existed at that particular time in terms of what lesbians were faced with. Just in general times, because women were really second-class citizens in those days. They weren't recognised really as sexual beings. They were there for either procreation or just having sex with a husband. We didn't have equal pay. When I started working, there was no equal pay in the early 70s. If you wanted to get a loan, and Margaret McMahon, who was my partner at the time, and I were both teaching. Now, we were on reasonable salaries in comparison to a lot of other women. However, when we wanted to get a loan for a house, we had to have a male guarantor. So even though I fought that with the bank manager, eventually my brother-in-law had to come in and sign papers. I mean, it was highly embarrassing. Lesbians in those days also ran the gauntlet of being picked up by the police for cross-dressing, or being, bashed or raped by heterosexual men for not, for stepping out of the traditional female role of needing a bloke around. they were also threatened by a loss of a job for being openly gay or appearing not feminine enough. And within that, you have to recognise that women of different classes were more oppressed than others. I would have been in the middle class. I could get away with a lot of things, although I couldn't be openly lesbian as a teacher at the beginning. But women who were, say, working in
Can someone turn it off, please?
We turn our phones off and
women who were working in areas like parking cars or delivering things, they found it very, very difficult. And some of them did cross-dress and act as males and get jobs as males, partly to attract the higher level salary, but also to stop the harassment. One could be refused access to an ill partner in hospital as you weren't seen as the next of kin. So therefore, direct family had priority in those sorts of situations. Lesbians who had children, many of them lost custody of their children unless the male, was an alcoholic or something like that. Lesbians couldn't adopt. It was legal in those days to discriminate against lesbians and gay men. Lesbian couples with their children were not recognised as a family for medical insurance. If your partner died and they had superannuation, you couldn't automatically get that because you weren't seen as the next of kin. And of course they weren't tolerated in the armed forces. And really they were encouraged to tell on others that were in the armed forces so that they could be eradicated. Also, of course, lesbianism was seen as a psychiatric illness. That's the classification. So lesbians in the gay movement in the early 70s were yet to have their voices heard in any way, as Sue was elucidating. And so the particular issues that affected lesbians as distinct from male homosexuals were not articulated. Now I joined camp just after, as I said, Sue and Gabby were on TV. And I do remember the famous meeting where Sue and Gabby walked out. I just... Yeah. And I had...
happens so many times.
No, I have to say it because Gabby loved to annoy some of the blokes in camp. And so she had this big banana and she slowly peeled it bit by bit. And then when she was really annoyed, she'd go like that into the banana. Yep. But I mean, mainly and I didn't understand this at the time because Marg and I were only just coming in, didn't know any better, didn't know anything else about the sexism that existed in the organisation. And that was not a value that seemed to be questioned by the men in the group. So Marg McMahon and I went on to, she became the co-president with Peter Bonselboom. and I was sitting on the executive of camp in various things like editor of Camp Inc. and executive positions. The executive recognised, I think, after the second walkout of women, that and it was a new executive, so that the men there at that time appeared to pay more attention to both sexism and racism. I think it was also the times too, in the early 70s, where awareness was coming through lots of different cultural areas. So we remained on that committee for some time. There was also a push to be more political. As Sue had said, it was more educational, changing people's values, but also they had what they called Phone a Friend, which was, for a lot of the women, they called it Phone a Fuck, but it was supposedly a counselling. Of course, not many women rang up at all. It was mainly men that rang up. So camp at those days was seen much more as a social and psychological support group by the participants that went. So there were social functions and there was the running of Phone a Friend. It did change a bit. Also, with the lesbian group that met on Wednesday nights, what Margaret McMahon and I found was that the women would turn up and we'd have coffee and we'd discuss lots of things. However, they appeared to, find a girlfriend and then they'd disappear from the group. And then, of course, what do? You've lost an ability to politicise anybody. And then when they'd lost the girlfriend, they'd come back again. So we felt it just became a revolving door. So just more of a support mechanism. So therefore, our effort went back into the executive and looking at things that could be done within that to bring up lesbian issues. We did educate a lot, doctors, counsellors, marriage guidance counsellors before the Family Law Act started in 75, and then the family law counsellors, etc. And we had both male and female going out so that the issues of lesbianism as distinct from male homosexuality was also covered. We did make many submissions to the government on various things, and I do remember we did a big one on sexism in education, and also human relationships, which is the one where Michael Clossy lost his job in a Catholic school because he had his name attached to that. In all of these submissions that we did make to government, we did try and cover both male and female homosexual issues. In 1975, though, with the coming of Gough Whitlam and the changes, and remember 1975 was the International Women's Year, we applied from the executive to get money to run some seminars on lesbianism. Now, this hadn't been done before, nor had anybody got money for this sort of thing. We did apply for, I think it was 30,200. We received 4,000. However, that was quite good, and we did run 2 seminars at Sydney University, which focused exclusively on lesbians, and Marg and I ran those. So we did attract lesbians not only out of the gay movements, gay liberation, camp, etc., but also the lesbian feminists who were working in women's areas, a lot of individual lesbians, lesbian feminists, and so it was quite good. And what happened was that out of it we created 2 booklets, and those booklets on lesbianism were sent to every principal, school counsellor, members of the legal and medical profession, politicians and the mass media. Well, you can guess how many of those that were left, probably, after they threw them out. But anyway, also in camp, Jim Walker and I were running a subgroup of the executive looking at custody cases, because this was an area that hadn't come up before. We really only found about 2 gay male custody cases. The rest were all to do with lesbian mothers. And so in 1976, with my more coming awareness too of working with gay males, was to actually remove myself and concentrate on looking at lesbian mothers. So we started a group on lesbian mothers in 1976. And this was mainly to support them and their children, and also help them through cases, to support partners of lesbian mothers who were co-parenting, and to run some social things where the kids could get together and talk to one another, because they may not have met anybody else who had a lesbian mother. We also did educational stuff like going and talking to the family law counsellors, and before that the marriage guidance counsellors. Another area where I thought, which of course was my interest area because I was teaching at that time, was lesbian teachers. Now there was a gay, male and lesbian teachers group which I did attend once or twice, but I felt that women approach things in a different way, and I was coming then from a more feminist stance, having been involved in women's liberation as well, and that we needed to get together as lesbians and talk about what we thought the issues were and operate in a different way, more consciousness raising way, where we discussed what was important to us. So our emphasis in the lesbian teachers was really about sexism and heterosexism. So not only were we supporting one another, we were trying to educate teachers in general in New South Wales. I did join the Women's Liberation in about, well, if you can, you just turn up, but in 1974. And what I found was that the issues were things like abortion on demand, available childcare, equal pay, women's health, refuges for women, etc. Now, they didn't necessarily want to know about lesbianism or lesbian issues, because I felt when I went and tried to raise anything, it was a pushback in general that lesbianism was really only a sexual choice. So all our needs would be covered by covering what women's movement in general was doing anyway, and their demands. Similarly, I joined WEB, and I was made the contact for lesbians, and the whole time I was there, nobody contacted me. However, in 1975, again as a result of Gough Whitlam, a lot of the women's refuges were funded, and women's health centres, etc. Now, they were mainly staffed, volunteer staffed before that, but mainly staffed by lesbians. And it was interesting because the emphasis there was on them, because that was their interest area to continue looking at either providing refuge for domestic violence and the children, or women's health. There was no look really in those days on lesbian health and their particular needs at that time. I did try at one stage in an attempt to break common ground at it was a general women's movement conference. I tried to put lesbian issues on the agenda, and what I thought was maybe they would have, it would sound more credible to talk about lesbian mothers because they might be supportive of that. And I did find that the women were supportive of that, partly because they identified their concern of children being taken away. In general, there was a disinclination I felt for lesbians that were involved in either running the refuges or women's health centres, etc., to put lesbian issues onto the agenda because they started to be funded. So they didn't want it to be seen as a way of money being taken away either. Around this time, like I'm talking 75, 76, 77, that time, and I'm not going to go much further than that, but what happened was that lesbian feminist groups did start to arise out of it. There were lesbian action groups, there were lesbian consciousness raising groups that started talking about what the particular issues were. They were sort of not as a general movement, they seemed to be more pockets. And also what was happening at that time was there was a move away to become separatist lesbian feminists. Some people set up rural communities by themselves, and you probably all know about women's land, etc. And some wanted to run alternative lifestyles, so say move to a rural, community to farm. Some joined environmental groups, and some stayed in Sydney, because I'm talking mainly Sydney based here, to become lesbian feminist groups, but they evolved sort of further down the track, if I'm keeping to the earlier 70s. I mean, all of these groups have added a richness, I think, to the tapestry of the lesbian groups and their evolvement, basically. However, by that time, I'd certainly moved out of being involved in gay male groups because I just felt that there was not enough influence to change the institutions in society, to look at those and analyse them and work out where sexism and heterosexism fitted in and how the power differential supported the sort of normative lifestyle that was being led in the gay male area. And I still think that there needs to be change there. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We're going to ask for questions. Who wants to make a question? Yes, Margot.
Look, I was wondering, because it's not something I know, even though I was living in Sydney in the early 70s, very involved in women's liberation, and slowly thinking about lesbians. But what would somebody like to elucidate? Where did gay liberation come in? Did that come out of camp, or was that a breakaway group from camp? Because both speakers, or all speakers, have referred to it, but I don't actually understand the connection.
Gay Liberation was a breakaway group from within camp, led by Dennis Alderman, among others, who decided they were more radical than John Ware anticipated camp would be. So they set up groups that were separate, and the women in the gay liberation groups faced exactly the same problems as the women in camp did. And in fact, their reactions were, in fact, ruder than ours were. Okay, so, I mean, they had their own newsletter, they came out of Green Point Road, and in fact, they folded more often than not than anything. Right. There's just one other thing I want to ask you to add to what Robin spoke, and that is that it was really important in Sydney Women's Liberation that the men pissed women off so much that we went to women's liberation, and in fact caused a great deal of ruckus at conferences as the 1973 Women's Commission, where John Ware tried to chain himself to the audience seat until he was removed. He felt aggrieved. And the conference, the Women's Commission was told him to piss off, and he did. But that was one of the earliest places where lesbianism showed itself within women's liberation, and it just got so much stronger within women's liberation that there were people about 77 or 8 who were really pissed off that there were so many lesbians in women's liberation that their heterosexual didn't get a word in. So, I mean, it's just waves, and it's true.
So the gay liberation started in 1972?
End of 71, 72.
Oh, okay, so reasonably
Early.
And essentially, when did it fold? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of petered out.
1973.
Thank
it
you.
formally closed itself. Some of the people involved in it went on to form the Gay Liberation Press. People like Paul Foss and stuff like that, putting out publications. But Gay Liberation, Sydney Gay Liberation, basically folded at around about late 1973. But there were still gay liberation groups at the University of New South Wales, Sydney University, and also Macquarie University.
Okay, another question. Yes. Do you want to stand up?
Yeah. Hi, my name's Alex. I'm interested about women and their children, and you mentioned that women were losing custody of their children, and I was assuming that it was women who were in relationships with men and then left those marriages and entered into relationships with women. But I'm wondering, just access to, were women having children with women at that time, and what was the laws around? I mean, obviously IVF wasn't an option, but what were the laws around women having children on their own? And
Turkey-based.
Turkey-based, thank you. Yeah, I'm interested more in that. And how common was it for women to lose custody of their children? Could you speak a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Yes, definitely I was speaking about women who had left marriages with men. But yes, I was IVF, and well, it came in round what, 75, 76?
Access.
Yes, it was people doing it for themselves. So they were seen as really single parents.
I think
Yes.
1980 was one of the first successful IVF cases in Melbourne between a lesbian couple, like first, certainly lesbian couple to access IVF in that way, yeah.
Tell us about, can I say something about that?
Hang on a sec, we've got another question here, and then yourself, Spider, then Margot, then you. Okay?
Oh, sorry. Oh, hi. Are you Kate as well?
I am. I'm Kathy or Kate. Okay, mine's really brief. I'm Kathy, feminist historian. Where were the headquarters of camp?
All over the place. The first one was in Balmain Road, and it was sort of like the Darling Street, but it was opposite the library almost.
Yeah, near the fire station.
But it was next door to the fire station, and in fact, I think it's still now available to the big restaurant or something like that. It's an old house, and one of the newspapers, Telegraph or Mirror or whatever it was, had a coverage, and the title was "The Night the Fireman Called me Fruity." The night the one that calls me Fireman Sweetie. Sorry. Sorry. But it also moved because they couldn't find places to Davis Street,
Forest Lodge,
then
and then we went to Darling Street. Glebe Point Road.
33
33
Road, yeah.
But it started off in Balmain.
Kate, then Spider, then Margot.
Alright. So I'm just interested in.
Hello, Kate.
Who said that? Oh, hi, Sue. I used to run a long time ago. So as a baby lesbian in the 70s, and I came from England in 76.
Hey, can you speak?
So I'm kind of, so within what you've talked about, there was a kind of a second wave, right? So all these lesbians getting involved, and I was then a lesbian separatist for some time. And do you know anything, or can you talk about, the Women's Warehouse? I don't know whether anybody remembers the Women's Warehouse, but it was this phenomenal fire trap. I think about it. It was a fire trap, but it was down in the Haymarket. And we just had an explosion of activity there. And I remember the late Sue and Chris, anyway, they shared a household. We did a lot of actions as lesbians around Fred Nile and the Right to Life and all of that sort of stuff. So there was a whole, it was really good to not have to work with men. And that whole thing has kind of petered out as well. And I take your point about the more things change, the more they stay the same. But, I'm just wondering whether you can expand on that, whether in your research, Sophie, you can sort of that.
I have lost. I don't have any trouble with groups petering out, because another one will come in its place. And that has always been the case, certainly within women's liberation and with camp or organisation or lesbian organisations. So if there's enough interest from enough people, it will keep going. If there is not enough interest, it's not worth keeping going. So that's, I think, what happens.
I think with the Women's Warehouse, there's probably some people in the room that have memories of it or went there, and better to speak to it. But in my research, certainly talked about it as this very vibrant space, very much a lesbian identified space, different levels of women coming and playing in bands, playing music, a cafe, all kinds of dances, a space just for a lot of creative output and a social space that was kind of unprecedented, and there's not been one like it since. Yeah.
It's really fun.
Over here? Yes.
I just wanted to talk about lesbian-assisted single mothers. The Women's Healing Centre started in Balmain and then moved to Annandale and had a great deal of financial support through paying for clients from the Leichhardt Women's Health Centre. But one of the things that we did was we negotiated between a group called the Gay Fairies and women lesbians who wanted to be mothers. And from the Gay Fairies we received like a health report of known family diseases and an AIDS clear test. And then we would receive paper bags with jam jars in them and we would deliver them to the mother, and this then protected the woman, the lesbian, from any future claims of parenting. There was no father because we had been the brokers in that. And it was incredibly secret. I mean, because I was part of it, I may be the only one in the room that knows that we did this, but there was a group called the Gay Fairies, and we absolutely demanded this health cleared thing before we passed the paper bag on.
Margot, you had something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, no, I just
And then
thought
we'll take
if
some
Rob's
others.
okay with it, especially after the speaker here about lesbian parenthood, it would be good to tell the story of the actual Mark's court case, of winning it.
Yes, that
Makes
was
sense.
later.
Late 70s.
Microphone.
Late 70s, early 80s.
Yes, Mark McMahon had 2 children actually. She and I in about 73 actually nicked the girl from the parents and had her for about a year, but then she wanted to go back to be with her brother, so she was allowed back to go to the father again. I'm just giving this brief interlude because she eventually decided that she wanted to go back and live with Margaret. I wasn't with Margaret at that stage. And under the Family Law Act at that time, that if you were, I think, 12 or 14, you were allowed to be interviewed by the judge and give your preferences. So that's what happened, and I mean, you know, it was known that Margaret was a lesbian, and yeah, she ended up getting custody of her daughter again, which was great, and it was, you know, one of very few where that
Wasn't it the
happened.
first one in New South Wales?
Possibly.
That's my
Well, I
memory
mean,
of
yeah,
it.
Family Law Act's only in, yeah.
Federal, is it? Or federal? Anyway, that's my memory of it, is that was in, what, late 70s?
Yep.
Was the first woman who'd been openly lesbian in court, probably because she had no choice because she was known,
No.
who was actually awarded custody of one of her children.
Okay.
I remember it, but people, the news passed around like wildfire. She's won. You know, oh my God, because we're all expecting her to just go down in another heat.
Yeah.
Questions?
This one,
Yes. Come forward. Oh, Hannah.
I just want to make a comment about Robin's stories about the early relationship between women's liberation and lesbianism, which I think was, you know, had slightly different histories in different cities.
I'm sure.
And I can remember I grew up in Adelaide, and in 1973 it was my last year at school, and I would go up to the Women's Liberation Centre after school in my school uniform looking for lesbians because I knew that was where they hung out. And I was right. And there were a lot of them, and a lot of them had been to the school I was then at. And actually they were really active in decision making and forming, I guess what you might call the feminist, practical feminist political theory of the day. There was a small group of them, I remember particularly, who all became my friends, who were older than me. They would have been postgraduate students and beginning tutors in Adelaide Uni at that time in various different departments, history, politics, English. And they would publish Refractory Girl. They were the Adelaide Collective of Refractory Girl. And I mean, it might be because lesbianism was my big interest and that I was so aware of the massive lesbian presence in women's liberation in Adelaide, and it seemed to me that that was the directing presence. And certainly by the time I arrived in Melbourne at the start of '78, I think that lesbians were definitely running Melbourne's liberation. I mean, they were the bulk of women's liberation in Melbourne.
78.
Beginning of '78, yeah.
I agree. I think what Sue said before in Sydney, that a similar sort of thing happened.
Yeah.
However, what I'm saying is that there were not lesbian issues apparent on the table
Yeah.
that women's liberation was looking at in general.
Okay, I think that's
Oh, Sue.
I just want to add that people started doing head counts and realising that the mainstay of the most common activities like abortion and childcare and stuff were all lesbians. I mean, there's no doubt that anybody had that in Sydney as well.
Mona?
Look, it was definitely an issue with, and became more so middle 70s till it switched. I agree with you, Sue, that it more, in women's liberation in Sydney, it more became, well, are heterosexual women welcome as well? It was, and so there was a tension there for all through the late second half of the 70s, I think, where it's interesting. I do agree that the heterosexual, if you like, issues, which were abortion and childcare, was essentially heterosexual at that stage, and contraception, and many of the women running those campaigns were lesbians. And I remember one discussion, I can't remember the exact context, whereas a heterosexual woman was saying, well, can I still be heterosexual and still be, a feminist in this group or whatever? And one of the lesbians saying, by all means, but I'll tell you now, if all the lesbians left Sydney Women's Liberation, it'd collapse. So there was always a tension there for quite a while, I think. And I remember, I was involved in the Sydney Film Co-op, and we had this very important meeting in October 1973, where we looked at the role of women in film as both behind the camera and as makers, i.e. there was hardly anybody, mind you, there was hardly a film industry, but nevertheless, and the roles that actresses were forced to take if they wanted to get work. They had to be the screamers or the fainters or the da-da-da-da-da. And I remember Leslie Lynch, if somebody knows Leslie, getting up at our huge Saturday night discussion, which the joint was jumping, it was fabulous, saying, and by the way, I'm a lesbian. And I looked at her and I was surprised that a bolt of lightning didn't come down this night and strike it in on the spot. I wasn't at that time. And she said, I'm absolutely sick of all of these discussions, all in totally heterosexual context. And if anybody out there says to you, oh, you're all just a bunch of dykes, you all go, oh, no, we're not, we're normal, no, we can work. So I made a resolution there and then that if any man ever came up and said that to me, I'd go, yes, I am, and so what? Mind you, no man ever did come up and say that. But it did start a little train of thought in my mind. Well, anyway.
Peggy,
Was an issue.
stand up, please.
I think we haven't, there's another whole group we haven't really talked about, which is sort of the apolitical lesbians. There was, from the very early days, there were lots of lesbians who didn't come into camp, they didn't come into women's liberation movement. They had small groups in suburbs, social groups, support groups, etc. Quite a few of those groups still existed well into the 80s of having no contact much at all. And so I don't know if anybody's done any work in the dens. That was one point I just wanted to make, that there was whole cohorts that really didn't touch anywhere that we're talking about now. And the second thing I think we haven't talked about is the influence of lesbians in left parties on various movements, including the women's liberation movement, but you know, like those lesbians in political parties, whether it was the Communist Party or, I don't know, the International Socialists, or God help us, the Marxists. You know, some of those groups caused huge ruckus in both lesbian and women's liberation politics, and others worked extremely well and contributed enormously in that area. So that's the other one. And the third one is, I think you're a bit tough, Robin, on the lesbians in the early women's services. You know, which I worked at Marrickville Women's Refuge from about 78 on, and I sort of understand what you're saying about lesbian issues not being very overt, but I mean that was largely because we were dealing overwhelmingly with heterosexual women who were fleeing violence, and I don't actually think it had much to do with worries about funding or anything else, so maybe I misunderstood you when you said that. So,
I can just briefly speak to a couple of those things. So in the oral histories that I did, a few of them were with women who absolutely sort of spent much of the 70s and 80s as not politicised, where their main networks were in bars, sort of in a kind of like, I guess, small sort of butch femme bar dark scene, and that was very much their lesbian network for a long time, though they did eventually later become politicised to some extent through things like women's services or through Mardi Gras through 1978 and things like that. And yeah, majority of the women I interviewed came out of the Communist Party, New Left, Trotsky sort of organisations, and that was kind of their kind of main politics, and then took that into a whole range of things. Again, women's services, all were involved in women's services, saw that as a really core part of their activism, including also going into government, bureaucracy, the kind of rise of the Femocrat in the 1980s, lots of lesbians involved at a government level. Yeah, and I think that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, go.
I think you're right that there was an element of fear amongst some of the services of being identified as particularly the women's health centres, as being identified as run by lesbians. In fact, the redoubtable Claire Isbister used to run campaigns against, in particular, Leichhardt Women's Health Centre and Liverpool Women's Health Centre. Liverpool Women's Health Centre was brought up on a charge of bringing, I think there was a young woman who wanted an abortion, and because the collective was run by lesbians, there was a that these people adversely affected her independent judgment. And the only reason that the Liverpool Women's Health Centre survived was because there was a change of government at the state level, and Frank Walker, the then Attorney General, brought a no bill. So there was an element of persecution and justifiable fear that funding would be cut.
Yes, I agree.
Robbins?
Hi, I just wanted to add to some of the comments, Rob, that you made about camp.
Yeah.
Robin and I were on the camp executive around the same time. And I just wanted to add a little bit of my experiences of being on camp. I joined in about 1974, actually as a direct outcome of the seminars that camp ran in International Women's Year. At the time I felt very isolated and didn't really know many lesbians. I'd been in the women's movement, but hadn't really been, I didn't even know camp existed at the time.
I was off at the law school in the city of Sydney, and there weren't really any active lesbian groups at the law school. Anyway, so I was delighted when I joined camp and became on the executive. I think one of the things that kept me involved in camp for really the rest of its existence was that I found that the men on the executive, at least, were actually quite aware of lesbian issues and quite supportive. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Enough of them to keep me involved. And I remember all the projects we worked on, we worked as equals. There was always women and men working on the different projects, such as the one you mentioned, Rob, the Royal Commission on Human Relationships, where we had four of us, you, myself, I think, Mike, and then Ron. We always presented like that, one man, one woman, two women, two men, because we always wanted to keep the lesbian issues equal but distinct. And so I think when the final break happened in late 78 or 79, it was a split between the more politicised parts of camp and the conservative part. So it was women and men that left to form a politically focused group, which was then called the Gay Task Force. And we continued on for a number of years, writing submissions and continuing the public education program that we've done in camp. So there are lots of nuances, I think, in our history, and probably your experiences also differ a bit from the time, you became involved and who you were actually working with at the time.
So when did CAP fall, do you think?
Why?
When CAP
Well, it was after the first Mardi Gras. I mean, there were a lot of tensions at that time between the Political Action Group, as I said, a mixture of men and women, and the people in the organisation who were also on the executive, who wanted to really focus on phone a friend, the counselling and support side, and really did not want the organisation to become more political. And it became a very difficult working environment. So I can't remember whether it was late 78 or maybe it went into 79, that the men and women who were much more political just thought, oh, they can have the phone counselling service, let them have it. And then it did then become joined in 2010. So 2010 and incorporating the gay counselling service.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Anyone else? Look, another thing, one of the things that I think is worth mentioning that lesbians were involved in the 1970s in Sydney is Women Behind Bars. Women Behind Bars was, if they characterised themselves in any way, it would be anarchist feminist. Anarchist definitely, the old civil libertarian push element there. In other words, they didn't really see themselves as women's liberationists, although there were women's liberationists in the group. And they were prison visitors to start off with. I think they wanted to do something about the situation of women in prison. Without going into who the personnel were, one of them now a High Court judge. I don't know if she likes to be reminded of her past too much, but anyway. She's in D.P. Duncan's film saying up there, but if we do what the cops want, then we'll never get anywhere. However, Women Behind Bars did two really important public actions, and I'm just trying to remember which one came first.
The Sandy Wilson.
The Sandy Wilson one or the Roberts?
Wilson,
Sandra
Wilson.
was first, wasn't she? Found a woman in prison who somebody had put in prison and thrown away the key, which they did in those days, particularly in women's prisons. In other words, no one ever reviewed their cases, they never came up before a parole board, nothing ever happened. As far as they knew, they were there for the rest of their life. A woman who'd been there, I think, probably 18 years or something like that, whose name was Sandra Wilson. And she was there because she had, her story is written by, now what's the Sydney lesbian history book that we just referred to before?
Rebecca Jennings.
Rebecca Jennings' book, which I meant to bring. Did anyone? No, it was just to say you should all read this. A fabulous piece of work, and it was launched here about 2 years ago. She tells the story of Sandra's life in that. Sandra's a working class woman who had a girlfriend whose parents totally were shocked by the relationship. They were living happily together in Bondi in a unit or something. The police busted into the unit, this is my memory of it, from the story in Rebecca's book, and basically hauled them both off, and they never saw each other ever again. To cut a long story short, Sandra, in some fit of whatever, rage, madness, who knows, just went out and shot the first man she could find. And he happened to be a taxi driver. That's how she found it. And so she was convicted of murder, correctly, but it was like, you know, no mitigating circumstances or no comprehension of anything, and lock her up and throw away the key. And Women Behind Bars took that case up, which was an interesting, I mean, you can see all of the issues that touches on. You know, it touches on lesbianism, it touches on women's incarceration, it touches on lack of mitigating circumstances for anything that women might have gone through before they got to the court. And the next case that they took up was a domestic violence case where a mother and her son were both convicted of violent Bruce Roberts, convicted of killing the husband and father in the case after 40 years of vicious domestic violence, but that was inadmissible evidence. So you can see the common thread there for Women Behind Bars, but it is interesting that the very first case they took up was of a lesbian woman and her dire story, you know. So
I think a lot of lesbians involved, particularly in the Sandra Wilson campaign. I remember sitting in the bus, the bus that was parked, and there were a lot of lesbians.
Most of the women in Women Behind Bars were lesbians. There's one other group that was, even though it wasn't a qualification. But we graffitied everywhere. There was graffiti all over the inner city of Sydney, Free Sandra Wilson. It was a really, really good campaign, and it was successful. Both of the campaigns were successful. They were both, in both cases, the incarcerated people concerned were freed eventually, but it had a lot of radio talk about things.
Thanks, Margot. Spider and then Christina. Spider. Okay.
Like you, I found Women's Liberation in Adelaide, and they were all lesbians. And I didn't come to Sydney until 1978. And what I want to do is thank you and everyone here who ever said anything at the office, or whoever said anything to a bus driver or anybody, because you lot made Sydney a wonderful place for me to be. Because there was a vibrant lesbian movement, and then we made the Women's Warehouse, and there was, you know, that coming to Sydney, there was a lovely lesbian life to lead here, and thank you all for being brave, because I didn't have to be quite so brave in Adelaide, as all of you had to be here. Thank you, every one of you.
Did you have a question, Chris?
Me?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, I thought you had.
I could have one, I suppose.
No, I don't really. Okay, yes.
So it kind of segues into First Mardi Gras because, you know, there's a lot of 78ers here, which is some of us that know we're still around. And from my memory, which, you know, I think gets lost a lot when we talk about the history of how many fucking lesbians were on that march that night. You know, like there were, I think, maybe 1,000 of us or something. There was a huge amount. And even though we were separatists and we had we had our own separate movement, we actually joined with the men on that night. And, you know, there were like half of us were arrested and thrown in jail. Like, I think the figures, we were 24, so we were 53, so working out was pretty much 50%. And I mean, and that changed the politics of gay and lesbian right there. And I just want to sort of, because it's Mardi Gras again, whether you want to kind of make some comments about how that changed, that night changed how we were in terms of the gay and lesbian politics.
That's the most outstanding mood
Yes.
spreader. Excuse me.
Robin knows more than anyone.
No. Yes, considering that we'd had a gay solidarity march in the morning per usual, which didn't garner a whole lot of people, and then had that in the evening, it was, I was amazed actually that we attracted so many lesbians, because I think the thought at the time in arranging it to go down Oxford Street was that we would try and make it fun looking so that people would come out of the bars and join us. But in essence, it started with a lot of lesbian feminists that, you know, I knew and everyone knew that whether they worked in women's sorts of, well, refuges or whatever, and a lot of the information went out via those different groups that existed to join, and they did that night, I think, because they thought it was something different, and there was a particular push to try and get the lesbians involved as well. So I think it was very wonderful actually that we had the large numbers we did. Unfortunately what happened with us going into the cross was not fantastic. However, thank God Digby Duncan was there filming it, because we had it all filmed, and it's been a sort of initiator of many things since then. So, you know, it was a turning moment.
One of the things that also needs to be remembered is the aftermath, and that is the women who organised to raise the bail money to help people get out. I mean, I wasn't there on the march, but I was there raising bail money and tried to follow the following rest as well. But also women lawyers were trying to get people out. So there was that, the aftermath as well, so strongly.
And I will add to that and say there was just such an upsurge of activism, both lesbian and gay men, that followed that. A lot of it happened together and some other separate groups, but a lot of things came out, both cultural and political, into the early 80s, arising from that. Yeah.
Could I just add on that one of the great surprises to me when I went back and reviewed some of my photographs of the second Mardi Gras in 1979, remember, it's a police-perpetuated Mardi Gras. The second Mardi Gras was, in fact, an anniversary of the first police bust. It was not supported by the bar queens, it was not supported by the bar owners, it was not supported by the press, and monies were actually gathered for bail, just in case the police did their usual thing. But the photos show something really quite extraordinary. Is the number of women that are actually on that 1979 march. It's really quite striking when I saw the photos and went, oh yes, of course, and because gradually they got written out of the sort of Mardi Gras history. It became a boys' event, particularly from 1981 onwards with the Southern Mardi Gras until the Kath Phillips coup in 1989. It's just the number of what it was. It was a coup. It was taking over from the boys. The number of women on that second march is really quite wonderful.
Yeah. Down the front here. Do you want to stand up and talk to the room? Ruth, please.
I actually have a cold at the moment, so probably a good idea. So I wanted to just kind of, it actually relates to what he was saying, but also respond to something you said, Sue, about how groups petering out is fine because new groups come up, and you know, that kind of concept. I came out in the early 2000s to a very different, queer community, which is, in my opinion, incredibly toxic to lesbians. It certainly was for me. And so for me, I was desperately wanting the communities that I saw when I read the history that lesbians had back in the 80s, and that all of my friendships that I formed with women in my early 20s were women who were significantly older than me, because they had completely different, feminism was a foundational core of their lesbian identity, which was the same for me, and I became a lesbian because I was a feminist. So I actually would argue maybe that disappearance of lesbian culture was not just a petering out that happened naturally and we don't need it anymore. I would argue that it was deliberate backlash and deliberate undermining. I was looking for lesbian feminism in uni, and we were never referred to any of the seminal, the lesbian texts that existed. I didn't know that lesbian feminism and lesbian culture existed. I didn't know that. I only found that out when I started meeting second wave women. And they introduced me at the Women's Library, and they introduced me to these incredible books that have been completely decimated in universities. And that knowledge is completely buried. Like, hardly any women that I talk to my own age or younger actually knows this stuff. They don't know it. They don't know that it exists. So I've had to fight for every single feminist conference that I've organised, for every single thing. I've had to fight for that to have the right to exist as female space against intense backlash. So,
Last two questions. Any other questions? Yes, Sue.
Oh yes, I was just wondering about the title of this afternoon, Lavender Menace. Where did that come from?
The US.
The National Organisation for Women, which was formed by Betty Friedan, which has in fact preceded women's liberation in America. They were horrified when lesbians started to attend their meetings, and some very stroppy lesbians attended, and she labelled them a lesbian menace. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes. Whatever.
So it's an ironic use of the term.
I'll actually add that, in fact, I wanted it to be called the lesbian menace. But the other people on the committee thought that was a bit too confrontational.
Margaret, one last quick word.
What Robert said and what Kate said is, I thought it'd be interesting to bring a gathering like this back to the Mardi Gras, since it's under the auspices that this is happening, which was, what Robert said, the next Mardi Gras in 79, so thanks for that information, was astounded by the number of women that were there. But Robert, you put a figure on just a minute ago when I was speaking of by 81, essentially the boys had taken over. And it's about then that I lost interest, which is, I think it was when the Gay Business Association had one of the biggest and most prominent, it became a sort of marketing opportunity that I really sort of phased out. But it's important in this context to remember that the gay and lesbian wasn't in there till Kath Phillips did the takeover in 1989. So the word lesbian wasn't even in it till 1989. And then I don't know the year, but I know sometime in the recent past, the last decade, say, there's been considerable discussion about that name should go anyway and it should become the queer Mardi Gras or something. So it seems to me, and this fits in a bit with what Danny was saying too, which is it seems to me that from about 1989 to maybe about 2009, you could actually use the L word in Sydney in a gay, in a wider political context, and it'd actually be acceptable, and that's what it means, and But that's about as long, and now you've got to say queer, or all-inclusive, or LGBTIQ plus XYZ, whatever. Like the woman who launched the Labor politician, Penny Sharp, who launched the lesbian history here, the hidden history of lesbians in Sydney, and she could not get up and say, I talked to her about it afterwards, but she wouldn't budge. I was swelling with pride, the room was packed with lesbians, and she got up and said, this is an important day for LGBTIQ plus XYZ people in Sydney. You could see the room go, no it wasn't. It was an important evening for the lesbians in Sydney. But you know, so it's an interesting thing about the lesbian word that Danny is now paying the price of, in a sense. There's this lost mob who want to find the lesbian existence, but how do they do it? So, yeah, that's my comment.
Do you want to stand up?
If we're kind of winding towards an end, but I think it's wonderful to hear so much about activism and what we've achieved and all the different kinds. Like I love the list you had, Rob, about immigration or being members of a private, well that was our thing, private medical fund. Those kinds of things. We made a huge amount of progress over the years from those, but I really think this is the point when we need to think about what's being rolled back. The religious discrimination bill is actually going to wind back a hell of a lot of that stuff, and it's the point at which we've really got to get together again and go back over all those things we won a long time ago, and which we now just accept, and which younger lesbians have a wonderful pleasure of being able to accept that we got a lot of those things. It's time to fight again. The religious discrimination bill is incredibly dangerous, and if you read it, it's actually has many things, not just about all our communities, but lots of things around women's right to abortion, contraception, a whole lot of things about the disability community and so on. It actually could be a very uniting thing that ought to fight against. But as we're coming towards the end of this discussion, I think we can't just assume that we won those things back then and that we're going to have them forever. They're actually totally under attack now, and we all need to get out there and write our letters and talk to our MPs and fight for what's ours.
Thank you very much for coming along and bearing with us. We have some air conditioning on, but it didn't really kick in for 60 plus of us in the room. Rob's going to briefly talk about the 20... You talk briefly and then I'll wind up. Thank you.
Firstly, I always saw this event as the opening event in what I hope will be a year of celebration for the 50 fabulous years of homosexual visibility, particularly in Sydney. Beginning with the Australian Lesbian Movement, going on to CAMP, to the gay liberation groups, not just Sydney Gay Liberation, but the gay liberation groups that formed on university campuses in the early 70s. It's through the bravery of those sort of pioneers that were involved at that time that we've actually got to the point we are actually at the moment. It's not just a celebration, however, of CAMP. It's actually the celebration of lesbian and gay visibility and the things that we've actually been able to achieve over the last 50 years. There are, as I said, this is the first, I saw as the first event of the 50 Fabulous Years celebration. In November, there's to be a display at the Library of New South Wales on that 50th anniversary. Pride History Group in November is also hosting the annual Homosexuals History Conference at UTS, done in conjunction with the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives. The Pride History Group is putting onto its website, when I finally edited for Sarah, a Pioneer Names Register, which lists all those people that were actually involved in those early years, right up to about 1990, covering the period of visibility the period of the pink triangle after the bust of the first Mardi Gras and through to homosexual law reform and anti-discrimination, and also HIV/AIDS. So that will be up. I promise shortly. But I'd actually like to see people involved in trying to agitate for other things. For example, I'm going to write to a number of organisations to see if we get support, because I think next year's Mardi Gras, being right on the 50th anniversary of the first public meeting, which was actually in February 1971, that we should actually have at that Mardi Gras a theme of visibility. I'd like to see those pioneers who still remain, like Robin, like Sue, actually leading the march, in front of the 78ers actually, leading the march, well, in Sue's case, being driven up in a limo. I'd like to see placards being held up for people who are no longer with us, like John Ware, like Lex Watson, like Margaret McMahon. I'd really like to see that sort of thing and a real celebration. So you'll be getting sort of some letters from me, but can you think of other things? I mean, one of the things we're thinking about is possibly, in conjunction with the Sydney City Council and the Inner West Council, a pink plaque project, so that there are numbers of buildings like 33A Glebe Point Road, like the place in Balmain, Paddington Town Hall, which are important heritage sites for us. And I think, you know, we're trying to actually get these organised. So try and think of projects that you think would be appropriate for your groups or as individuals, or if you feel like endorsing this particular proposal, which I'm trying to get together for Pride History and First Mardi Gras, then please feel free to actually append your name and say, yes, we approve of all that. Enough of me, sorry, I talked too long.
Okay, and a very big thank you to Sue, to Sophie and to Rob. Proceedings will be up on the First Mardi Gras Inc. website in short order, I dare say. That's 78ers.org.au. Pick up a card out on the table out there, and you can get our website off that. So thanks very much. Thank you.